Don't do cardio or else you definitely will not build strength or muscle. That's what a lot of people say. Honestly, those people are 100% wrong. That's not true. And we're going to talk specifically about how cardiovascular training is actually super important for elite levels of performance when it comes to bodybuilding or building muscle and strength and just performance in general. Cardiovascular conditioning is not optional in that sense. I genuinely don't believe that you can maximize your potential in any of those areas without having a sufficient level of cardiovascular or aerobic conditioning. We're going to go over all of the reasons why that's the case. So today, what we're going to talk about, we're going to discuss some of the very common bottlenecks to performance. We're going to discuss building work capacity and how that's going to affect your performance. We're going to talk about enhancing your recovery, improving your sleep, and we're also going to talk about how to get super big, rock hard boners. In terms of bottlenecks, really common bottlenecks to performance, one of them is going to be your work capacity. There are so many people who actually aren't fit enough to do the type of training that they need in order to get better. Now, this is less true for novices and intermediates, generally because those guys have much more of an adaptive reserve. Because they're not super well trained, they can do a lot less. And because of the novelty of it, their body's just going to get better and better and better. These are largely neurological adaptations, and you're kind of building some of the scaffolding and the foundation for hypertrophy and things like that. So there's a lot of initial adaptations you can get if you're newer. You can do a lot and get a lot of progress by not really working that hard, if I'm being honest. But when you start transitioning from novice to early intermediate to late stage intermediate to advanced and elite and so on and so forth, you have to do a whole lot more in order to get marginal progress. So the amount of investment you have to make is way more, and the amount of return you get is way smaller because you're already doing so much and you have a genetic ceiling. So you've already lifted and turned over all these stones. You're dialing in your diet, you're dialing in your stress management, your hydration, your training, your meal timing, your frequency, your supplementation, just everything you're doing is super on point. There's less that you can do and there's less levers that you can pull. So really it just becomes about consistency and really honing those details in as best as you possibly can in order to see the progress that you want. But again, as you become more advanced, things like aerobic conditioning become infinitely more important because you have less adaptive reserve to pull from. If your training requirement in order to get better is here, but your absolute capacity is here, you have to flirt with a very narrow window. And if you push past your tolerable limit, you risk injury and a whole host of other things. So we have to make sure that physically we're prepared to tolerate that type of super demanding training. And not a lot of people do that. And that's one of the big reasons why most people or many people, they plateau. Right now, there's lots of reasons why people plateau, including insufficient programming, lifestyle variables, insufficient effort in the training, and things like that. But for all intents and purposes, we are going to talk here about work capacity because that is a very big and common issue that I see, especially among the more high-level intermediate and advanced athletes. So poor recovery, low work capacity, and then poor adaptive responses. Again, all of that stuff is going to be limited by your work capacity. So recovery and work capacity are different, they are distinct, but obviously there's overlap. So let's first start by talking about some of the common misconceptions regarding aerobic conditioning. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the adaptations to training and specifically aerobic training. And then we're also going to talk about getting that big rock hard boner that you've always wanted. So first, we can talk about something called the interference effect. Now, the interference effect is something that was proposed several years ago, and there's speculation on what's actually going on like molecular levels, if there actually is molecular interference. Now, that might be the case in some areas, but largely what it boils down to, and this is more of a simplified version, is if you have $100 and I say, okay, I want to spend $50 to buy more strength, and I want to spend another $50 to buy more aerobic conditioning. Well, now I'm tapped out. So that $50 that I could have spent on my strength or my hypertrophy now is being spent towards cardiovascular training. So because I'm doing that, I'm not getting that full $100 worth of strength that I could have purchased previously. And I'm getting no muscle that I could have purchased because I've dedicated 50% of my resources to strength and 50% to cardiovascular conditioning. So that's kind of a high level perspective of, the interference effect and how it works. It's we have a certain amount of resources, we dedicate them into one area or another, or we distribute them over, multiple different modalities. And essentially you're going to get diminishing returns the more you divide up that piece of the pie that you have. Now, part of that is because of an allocation of resources. The other part is going to be because of something called the SAID principle. So the SAID principle is specific adaptations to imposed demand. It's obviously an acronym. So what that means is that if we are training for strength, there are specific neurological and motor coordination adaptations that occur to allow us to generate the maximum amount of force in order to be expressed through a particular movement, whether that be stone, bench press, a squat, a yoke carry, or anything of that nature. Okay, so we have to make sure that those adaptations don't necessarily conflict with other adaptations. So if we're looking to build up straight up aerobic endurance or VO2 max, things like that, and we're really trying to push our aerobic or anaerobic capacity in other ways. If we're trying to push our aerobic and muscular endurance, let's say specifically for running or for long distance running, those are two very separate types of goals. And if we really try and push in both directions and we try and push really, really hard, we're going to get diminished returns on both of them because they are oppositional in nature. Now, that is true to a degree. So that aspect of the interference effect is true. However, that is irrelevant because that's not proper training anyways if you're trying to maximize like muscle and or strength or performance in some other aspect, because that would still require a division of resources in order to maximize that priority. Because if your work capacity is not sufficient, then we're not going to be able to train hard enough in order to really push strength. If your work capacity is insufficient, we can't recover to push strength and hypertrophy or anything like that, right? You can get progress, but you're not going to optimize your progress. So we need enough cardiovascular conditioning. We need enough aerobic fitness in order to push, but not so much that it actually starts to detract from our primary goals, which is strength and muscle growth at this point. So although, yes, there is a potential concern for the interference effect, realistically, if you're programming effectively, it should absolutely not impair your performance. In fact, it would actually enhance your performance because recoverability is a function of your aerobic fitness. If you have a very good aerobic fit level of fitness, you're going to be able to tolerate more volume, more intensity, more frequency, more of everything, which means you can push way harder and you can still recover, which means more productive training, extend over a longer period of time, better results, which is pretty awesome across the board. So that's the interference effect. And again, that's one of the reasons why most people don't necessarily understand what they're talking about when they say, oh, the interference effect, you shouldn't do cardio, it's going to hurt your gains. Not true. If you do stupid things, yes, that's going to harm you. But if you do stupid things only doing strength, that's also going to harm you. So moral of the story, it's not cardio that's wrong, just don't be stupid. That's the bad part. Okay. So that's a lesson you can take outside of training as well. So the next thing is kind of piggybacking on what I just mentioned is it's a dose response relationship. If I do, let's say 15-minute intervals on a rowing machine or a skier or something like that, that is a very, very different type of fatigue that's generated versus doing sprints on concrete in bare feet every single day. So it's a dose response relationship. How much are you doing? What's the intensity? What's the frequency? What's the modality? The modality is also very important, right? Because we can look at running. Running is going to have a higher impact on your joints. It's going to have more stress on your Achilles tendon and maybe your quad tendons and things like that. Maybe not for smaller athletes, but for larger athletes. So I'm 250 right now, and this is the lightest I've been in a while because I'm at the end of my cut. So I just finished cutting and I'm still 250. I'm probably going to go back up to 275, 280, something like that. And I do run, but it took me a while to be able to build up to running because there's a certain amount of stress orthopedically that you're going to generate when you're running because there's that impact. So running is going to be higher impact and higher fatigue costs than, let's say, something like doing the elliptical or a ski erg or an assault bike or a rowing machine, right? So there's all sorts of different types of modalities, and you can even do aerobic fitness training utilizing resistance training. You can structure like a circuit or something like that, and so there's lots of different ways you can do it. But the modality matters, the intensity matters, the frequency matters, and then it also matters when we actually plug it into the broader picture of your program. So we might have a great conditioning program and we might have a great training program, but we need to make sure that both of those things come together and work effectively and have a synergistic effect, or else that's where you start to run into problems. But again, that boils down to not being dumb and utilizing good sports science principles when it comes to programming, recovery, and lifestyle management. Okay, we'll move on to adaptations to aerobic conditioning or cardio. First of all, we see decreased heart rate, we see greater venous return, we see increased stroke volume, which means the actual volume or the size of the amount of blood that's being pumped per pump goes up, right? Which means it's more efficient, which again is important for oxygenation, it's important for nutrient transport, and a whole host of other things. Now, this is Eggington 2003, published that research, okay? We have another paper where we see increased capillary density, and capillarization increases oxygen and nutrient transport to muscle. We see increased glycogen repletion and glycogen enhancement, thereby improving recovery and performance from session to session, as well as just from exercise to exercise and even set to set. And we can see that was, I don't know how to pronounce this, Grewe et al., 1999. We see an enhanced clearing of metabolic byproducts. So things like hydrogen ion. I know a lot of people talk about lactate and, oh, like lactic acid buildup, and that's why that's that burning sensation in your muscles. That's actually not lactate. Lactate is actually really important because it enhances time to exhaustion. Okay. The metabolic byproducts that you're talking about that actually start to impair performance are more things like the hydrogen ions that are released. That tends to really impair performance. Lactate is actually important for buffering a lot of those waste products, and so you can actually enhance or extend your time to exhaustion or fatigue. Now, aerobic conditioning can also enhance sleep quality and duration. This is just something that we see practically, right? If you're doing really heavy neurological training, the type of fatigue you get is neurological. So one of the side effects of that is actually not being able to sleep, right? Of overtraining is impaired sleep, just being super wired all the time, really stuck in fight or flight mode. Whereas if you're doing more aerobic type conditioning, it's fatiguing, but it's the kind of fatigue that actually makes you exhausted. You get done your conditioning, you're like, oh, you're just wiped and you want to go to bed. So practically speaking, for most people, having some element of aerobic conditioning can actually enhance and stabilize your sleep cycles and can actually be really important for that too. So that's been something that I've noticed for myself. I've noticed for lots of my clients, and it's just such a consistent theme. And also there is research showing that association, but it's not like a linear association. It's not like the better your conditioning is, the better your aerobic fitness is, the better your sleep is going to be. But there is a relationship. It's just not linear, right? Now, lastly, we can see that improving aerobic fitness is actually super important for erectile dysfunction. We look at individuals who have erectile dysfunction, and one of the big recommendations that medical doctors will give is they'll say, okay, one, are you super overweight? If you are, you need to lose weight. Are you in good shape? If you're not, you need to get in better shape. And when I say shape, like just general physical fitness. And part of that is going to be improving your aerobic conditioning. Because again, when we improve aerobic conditioning, we improve capillary density, we improve stroke volume, we improve your body's ability to pump blood into that ginormous, frickin' thick, girthy dick. And from there, you can just get super awesome boners. If you're a dude watching this, doing conditioning is going to make you super strong, super jacked if you do it correctly, and it's going to give you really awesome boners so that you can sleep with your wife or your girlfriend outside of marriage in direct defiance to God. And if you are a girl and you're watching this, then you might not be able to get really big, awesome boners, but you can go and you can tell your boyfriend this or your husband, and they can start doing conditioning, and then they can get better boners, and you guys can have a happy marriage. So, what are some strategies to actually increase your aerobic conditioning? There's a multitude of different approaches. Okay. And there's lots of right ways to do things, but there's also lots of wrong ways to do things. So, I want to give you a couple very simple ways that you can think about improving your aerobic conditioning. Now, one, and this is a very easy approach that is extremely underutilized, is just timing your rest periods. For every single one of my athletes, I always time their rest periods. Okay. Not only because I want to make sure that they can complete the training in a certain amount of time, because some of my athletes will have time constraints, but also because I want to know what their work capacity is like. If I tell someone, hey, I want you to do, you know, let's say 4 sets of 6 at 80%, and I only give you 120 seconds rest or 180 seconds rest, that is not a lot of time to recover, especially if you're very strong. That means in order to recover and actually hit those sets of 6, you need to be in very good shape. So I know that if you can hit that, I know you're actually way stronger than what you're even projecting, because I know that if I were to take that rest period and I were to give you 5 minutes or 7 minutes, especially when you start peaking, I know that your strength is going to shoot through the roof because now you have way more time to recover, so you can actually express your strength more effectively. So I always program rest periods for my clients, always, at all times. Now, I'm not saying that you need to do this, and there's plenty of athletes who don't time their rest periods, and they're phenomenally strong and phenomenally jacked. So I'm not saying this is the only way. I'm just saying that it's a very effective tool, and it's one that I use all the time. So timing your rest periods, giving yourself shorter rest periods, especially when you're in like more of an accumulation cycle, when you're doing a little bit more volume, intensity is not quite as high, things like that. Or even when you are going through a strength block, curtailing your rest can be a very effective thing to not only limit the amount of fatigue you can generate, but also, again, improve your work capacity. So playing around with rest periods can be very effective. Again, you're going to have, you know, you're going to have to individualize it to yourself. And if you're someone who's not in great conditioning, like in great shape, and you're just like, oh, I'm going to jump into super short rest periods, you're probably going to mess yourself up. You'll need to have some sort of a runway for progression for these. So just keep that in mind when you do start making some of these adjustments or implementing some of these. The next thing is you can increase work density. So I like to use density protocols with certain clients. It's not necessarily appropriate for everyone, and it's definitely not appropriate at all times. So this is something that I would use further away from competition. So if we're in like an accumulation block, or if we're just in an off season or something like that, I might want to push their conditioning a lot more. So I might use a density block. So an example of this is, let's say I pick 4 exercises, right? Let's say, so for my strongman athletes, I do this all the time. Let's say sandbag carry, maybe like a deadlift, maybe some sort of an overhead press, something like that, right? Like it doesn't really matter. I'm just picking random things, and maybe like a farmer's carry. Okay, let's just say those ones, right? And again, this is hypothetical, so don't copy that because I haven't even thought about it. I'm just rambling off exercise. So I might say, okay, do a certain amount of reps for each of those exercises. Okay, and I want you to go through them for 15 minutes. 15 minutes straight, no break, and get as many rounds as you possibly can in 15 minutes. Then the next week, I might say, okay, I want you to get the same number of rounds, but this time you only get 12 minutes. Complete the same number of rounds, same weight on the bar or same load that you're using, but you only have 12 minutes now to do it. So you're going to really have to push hard. Then I might say, okay, now we're going to repeat it again. Next week, we're going to go 12 minutes, but you have to increase the number of rounds you do. So we're constantly pushing the work capacity. Okay, now again, that's a circuit. It's only going to take 15 minutes or 12 minutes or 10 minutes, 8 minutes, whatever it is, but it's a density protocol. So we're increasing the amount of actual work being done within a fixed period of time. So that's another very effective strategy. Now be careful about this. I generally don't run density blocks for very long. Now a density block, it's not like the whole block, like every day is going to have something like that. I'll usually just incorporate it on one day, and they'll have that density protocol in there. And I'll probably only run that for about 4 weeks before like pulling back and maybe having a deload on that, giving them a little bit more time to recover, because this can be very fatiguing depending on who you are, depending on what exercises you're doing, depending on your recoverability, your aerobic conditioning, and your general like skill of doing these movements as well, right? Because as you become more proficient, there's greater movement economy, there's less energy expenditure per unit of work that you put out, a higher threshold, things like that. So it's a little bit complicated, but keep it very simple. Density protocols, very effective. I use them all the time, especially for multi-sport athletes or like CrossFit athletes or people who are doing a lot of dynamic work like strongman and things like that. So another one that's actually incredibly simple, believe it or not, is just walk more. This is one of the most simple things you can do. Now, the reason why I don't necessarily prescribe this for everyone, although everyone that I coach does have a step count, but I wouldn't necessarily say that you want to do this to increase your aerobic fitness to a huge extent. Step count is good for just being generally healthy. It will improve your aerobic fitness, but it might not necessarily do enough to really get you in great shape. So it is very important to just be active, to be walking. That's super important for your health in general. And it is good for your heart, and it is good for your aerobic fitness. But a lot of the times that in and of itself is not sufficient to really push to the level that we need to in order to get higher level guys in really good shape. But it is a great place to start. So do not sleep on step counts. A lot of people say, oh, walking's not training, walking's not. I go for 2 walks a day. I get between 10 and 15,000 steps a day, no matter what. That is a really important part of my daily routine. And also there's tons of psychological benefits. There's tons of other physical benefits that have nothing to do with enhancing performance and things like that. So walking in general is super important for mental health, for just general health, but it's also very good for just building up a very low level of aerobic fitness that can translate into doing more productive work down the road. So again, if you're very deconditioned, if you've never done aerobic training before, just going for a walk might really gas you out. And that might be enough, especially for the really big guys who are super strong. That might be enough. Do that for, several weeks and then start incorporating some conditioning after that, once you acclimate to the new level of quote unquote aerobic fitness. Then you can also do sports specific or general conditioning. So general conditioning, great examples, West Side Barbell. They would always use the sled, or they do the prowler, or they do non-specific stuff where they're dragging the sled, they're pushing the sled, they're doing lots of that stuff. That is general. That's not very specific. But you can also do specific, which could be maybe you're picking exercises that are very relevant to what it is that you're doing. So again, if you're a powerlifter, maybe you can do some sort of protocol where you're doing like Bulgarian split squats, and then you're doing like maybe deficit push-ups or dips. Maybe you're doing some pull-ups, and you're just doing, let's say, those 3 exercises, and you have to complete 5 rounds of that when you have a certain time, like a certain period of rest or whatever after the little circuit. These are very important things. And sometimes having it be general might actually be beneficial, because that way there's not as much overlap. If you do a really heavy squat day and then you go for a 10-mile run the next day, that's going to beat the shit out of your legs. Whereas if you have a squat day and maybe you do conditioning, but it's like a ski erg, the ski erg is all upper body. You're just pulling on those things, and it's much less taxing on an area that you've already generated a ton of fatigue in. So you're not stacking up fatigue in a localized area. So general conditioning can actually be very effective if you want to mitigate the amount of fatigue and you don't want to overlap things like that. So again, just because it's sport specific does not necessarily mean it's better. There is a time and a place for everything, and it depends on how you put it all together. Okay, so that's where, again, we come back to that point of intelligent program design. Now, here's some practical considerations that are very important for you go out implementing these things into your program. Okay, the first is going to be your acute to chronic workload considerations. So what research has shown, and again, it's not a linear relationship, but there is a very clear relationship. Okay. If you go from doing, let's say, 10 sets a week for your chest, and you go to 30 sets a week, the probability that you're going to fucking tear your pec off in a couple of weeks goes up pretty damn high, because you've tripled your workload. Okay. You've gone from historically doing somewhere between, let's say, 8 to 12 sets, and you're always hovering in that range. And then all of a sudden you triple it all out of the blue. Your body's not going to have anywhere near the amount of time to adapt. So if you do decide to do some conditioning, don't just jump right in. And this is one of the comments that I made earlier when I said having a step count might be a really great transitionary period into actually doing more conditioning. Now, again, that's more for the really big guys, like who are like 300 plus pounds, who just are not in good shape in general. But for the general public, that principle still applies. You can't just go from 0 to 100. In fact, you don't want to. It's going to be counterproductive, and it absolutely will impair your performance over here. So instead, what you want to do is think about what's going to be tolerable and what will allow you to build up over time. So here's a great example. For me, because I'm a bigger guy, I generally sit around like 275, 280. That's where I feel most comfortable. So for me, running is a big problem. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to begin running and jogging as part of my conditioning. Now, not just to enhance my training performance, because the repeated kind of impact is hard on my Achilles and it's hard on my quad tendons. Okay, I feel a little banged up after. But the reason I'm doing it is because I just want to be mobile. I don't want to just be like a power lifter, focus on strength and not be able to move around. I want to be able to move around. I still love to fight. I did Muay Thai and boxing for many years, and I still want to be able to move around and be athletic. So running for me is really important. So when I decided to start incorporating running into my conditioning protocol, I didn't just go in and start running. I started with something super easy. I said 2 minutes of light jogging, very light, followed by 2 minutes of recovery. And I do that for 10 rounds. By the end of it, I've only done 20 minutes of total running. Okay. So the whole thing does not take a long time at all. But at the same time, that was way more than enough for me. That's a very easy protocol. But at the time, it was way more than enough for me. And it was rough. I did that for 6 weeks without changing anything, except for towards the end, I started increasing the pace a bit. But I had a fairly slow run for the first 4 weeks. Then the last 2 weeks, I picked up the pace and I started having a little bit more of a fast run instead of just a light jog. We picked it up, and that allowed me to be like, okay, now I'm ready to actually go into just a steady state run. So now what I'm doing is I'm just doing 20 minutes. Not a lot at all, not a huge run, but 20 minutes, steady state run, continuous, unbroken. So there's no more intervals. I have to be able to sustain that pace for the full 20 minutes. Now, after a little bit, I'm going to work that up to 30 minutes, and I'm not going to go any faster. I'm not going to go any faster. I'm not going to increase the time after that. The objective here is not to just continue pushing conditioning. I only want to push my conditioning to a certain point where it really helps my training, not to push my conditioning to the point where I can run a marathon in a really competitive time, because that is contrary to what I'm actually trying to accomplish over here in terms of muscle and strength and physique and things like that. So point is that you want to make sure you keep the goal. The goal is not to become an insane marathon runner. The goal is to get super strong and super jacked. So we need to make sure that we have a graded exposure. So we're not just jumping right in and beating yourself up and potentially risking injury because you went from 0 to 100. Okay. In the same way, if someone wants to squat 500 pounds, but they've never even been under a squat bar, you're not going to load 500 pounds on them and say, okay, give it a shot and see what happens. They're going to break their spine. They're going to, blow out their knees. Something terrible is going to happen. Same thing's most likely going to happen if you just dive right in and add all of this extra conditioning on you, because it's still work. It's still stress to your body that needs to be recovered from. So if you don't have sufficient recovery resources, and if your body's not able to adapt as quickly as you, guess what? You're probably going to get injured, or at least your risk goes up. And we want to avoid that. So want to make sure you have an intelligent approach. Start off lighter than you think, start off easier than you think, and then give yourself several weeks to build up. Like I said, it took me 6 weeks just to be able to do one basic 20-minute run, continuous, unbroken. I'm not going crazy fast. I'm just going at a decent jogging pace. Okay. And that took me 6 weeks. So you have to be patient. You have to be willing to be intelligent and just be disciplined about it, not just rush into things. Okay. The next thing is consider the conditioning, implement, or the modality. So as I mentioned, running was very hard on my Achilles and it was hard on my knees. Okay. But I chose to do it because I have specific reasons for that. Although that's generally not something that I would recommend right off the bat, because it is higher impact, there's more eccentric loading, it's going to be more fatiguing, and it's probably not the best, especially for bigger guys. But again, for bigger guys who want to remain just generally fit and still be active, then it would be good. But again, it's always going to be a trade-off in terms of what are the priorities and what are we trying to accomplish. So we can look at running, we can look at rowing, we can look at skier, we can look at just doing your conditioning through exercises, we can look at doing little conditioning circuits, we can look at the prowler or the sled, whether you're pushing, whether you're pulling, we can look at doing throws or just different things like that. There's so many different ways, but the modality that you choose is going to impact the amount of fatigue that's generated. So if it's something you're very familiar with, if it's something you're already very skilled at, and it's something you can do and you're like, yeah, it's no problem, then great, start there, right? Maybe it's not the right thing for other people, but because you've got a good history of it, then yeah, sure. So for instance, if you're a strength athlete, but you've got a long history of like playing football or playing soccer and like you're really good at running, go right ahead. It's not going to be a huge deal, right? So long as you do it in an intelligent fashion, it's not going to bang you up and it's not going to kill you. Okay. So don't be afraid of it. Just make sure you're doing it intelligently and you are progressing at an appropriate rate as opposed to just diving right in. The next thing is going to be the frequency, the density, and the fatigue considerations. Okay. So I do conditioning twice a week. That's it. But I also do conditioning technically in my training because I constrain the rest periods, things like that. So I have conditioning elements in my actual training, but the actual dedicated periods where I'm doing aerobic fitness training is only twice a week. Now, I'm not saying that's the way it should be for everyone. Some people, so like some of my clients, they do conditioning or like little circuits 3 times a week. Some of them do conditioning circuits like 4 times a week. Some of them do conditioning circuits just once a week. It really depends on the individual, their needs, and how they're adapting to the actual training. But these are important things to consider. You don't want to just start adding in conditioning every single day. You want to start conservative because it's much easier to push and add more on than it is to go too far and then be like, oh man, I'm super banged up. I got to take a week off. Oh, that wasn't enough. I got to change my training now. And you end up setting yourself back several weeks when if you were just a little bit more patient, you could have seen steady progress of the entire timeline. So again, the frequency that you're doing, the intensity, very important. You don't want to just go balls to the wall on this stuff. You want to make sure you select an appropriate level of intensity of effort so you can manage it and you can sustain it and you can get the adaptive results that you want in terms of your cardio without doing such high intensity cardio that you're completely messing up all of your training over here. Okay. Now, main theme here is slow and progressive. Slow and progressive. You don't want to do things that are going to set you back on your primary goals of getting super jacked, super big and strong, and getting rock hard, freaking over the counter boners. So if you like the video, make sure you hit subscribe. Stay tuned to the next one.